Hey everyone, it's Daz Drake here, owner of Athletic Performance Academy, and today I'd like to take you through a presentation that I recently gave at the RacketEdge conference that was hosted by Howard Green and Johnny Fraser. And this presentation is called 5 S's to Live By, the key to a successful S&C program. And I thought it would be cool to share it with you guys if you're following along on the website, but also I thought that for future APA coaches that come and work in the organization, it would be a great presentation just to introduce them to the APA training philosophy. So in this presentation, I want to briefly discuss the role of an S&C coach. I want to talk about some important principles of a good athletic development program, which are going to be underpinned by the 5 S's. And I'll also talk a little bit about some of the testing that we do at APA. Now, before we get into the main presentation, I just want to acknowledge all of the great coaches that work for me at APA, and I've highlighted some of those coaches in the photos there. And I think it's really important because I wouldn't be able to share the APA training philosophy across all these tennis academies without the support of some fantastic coaches like the ones that I'm very lucky to have in my team. And yes, they're all led by me, and some of our full-time coaches, we all aspire for them to be UKSC accredited because we're trying to make sure that we embody best practice. What unites is that we're all passionate about maximising athletic potential. What I have to do in my role is to develop a methodology that I can share with these coaches that can inform and support their practice so that we're all singing on the same hymn sheet and hopefully moving towards the same place with our tennis athletes. But what I'm really proud of as well is that often a lot of the tennis academies that we work in have become almost like a hub for coaches to come and gain experience and in many cases get some paid work with myself, and if not, being able to go out and get some paid work in other S&C organizations. So it's something I'm very, very privileged to do, and I'm very, very humbled by it every single day. And I'd also just on that note like to acknowledge all of the support that I've had over the years with a number of organizations that have really trusted me to go out and experiment on their athletes to develop these philosophies and these methods that I'm sharing with you. So I'm extremely grateful, and I hope that I'll have the opportunity to work with these organizations and ones like it for many more years to come. So what is the role of an S&C coach? It's really important that we can define this, because you've got to remember that sport alone is not going to stress our body system in a way that will promote many of the qualities that we want to develop. So from my point of view, I'm quite comfortable to be called a strength and conditioning coach. I know that some people take exception to that because they think that it doesn't define or doesn't go far enough at defining what it is they actually do. But let's just start with this as a working definition. As a strength and conditioning coach, clearly one of my main jobs is to get my athletes stronger. But from a conditioning standpoint, I see that as meaning I need to get them faster and I need to get them fitter. So for me, this strength and conditioning role really speaks to 3 of the S's that we're going to talk about today. But in order to really maximize someone's athletic potential, I think there's a couple of S's that speak a little bit more to the word athleticism that we haven't mentioned or is not included in this definition. And that's why I think some coaches prefer to call themselves an athletic development coach or something of that nature. Now, as well as being able to define your role and exactly what it is that you are trying to do, I think we also need to define your philosophy. And if you're going to work in a specific sport like tennis, you need to understand which specific aspects of fitness the sport specifically taxes the most and then prepare accordingly. And so really what you need to do is a needs analysis to understand the demands of the sport. And that's going to inform your strategy, which is the what. So what are the fitness components that you think you need to prioritize most? And then also the tactics or the methods, which is the how, which is how are you then going to go about and develop those fitness components specifically. So I've used the word strategy and tactics under needs analysis because it kind of speaks to the language of tennis coaches, which some of which are in the audience of this presentation that I was giving. Now, as far as defining what tennis is from a needs analysis standpoint, I've come up with this quote here from a journal article by Fernandez, which describes tennis as having rapid, explosive bursts of power repeated many times during a match, typically 300 to 500 high-intensity bursts in a 3-set match, and, unlike other sports, has no time constraint. So a match could last anywhere from 1.5 hours, maybe up to even 6. So from my point of view, the words that kind of stood out to me were power and repeated and burst. So for me, tennis is a power-based sport which has a huge endurance component. So I've defined it as power endurance. Now, in terms of what, therefore, I think peak physical preparedness looks like for tennis, in simple terms, it's the ability to play a best of 5-set match. You know, that's the ultimate test. Can one of my professional male athletes go out and maintain high quality performance throughout the period of a 5-set match and throughout all of those 7 matches they would have to play if they were going to win at Grand Slam level? That's the ultimate test. So what does that look like in terms of physical terms? Well, it's about being able to produce high levels of power for the duration of a match, which we described previously as power endurance. Now, how do I go about developing power endurance? Well, I think that you need to gradually increase the training stimuli specificity. And if we're going to call power endurance the end stage component, which for the purposes of these 5 S's we're going to talk about as stamina, then I think that we need to build the other components progressively that lead up to that. So, you know, you've got to start with coordination of the movements, which I'm calling skill. What I haven't mentioned here is, on top of that, we need to then develop someone's quality of movement, which is what we're going to call suppleness. And then on top of that, we can add the strength, add the speed, and then finally we can add the stamina. So that is, in a nutshell, how we're going to go about building this tennis athlete. And as I talk about here, I refer to the 5 S's. And you can see here that if stamina or power endurance is the end stage, that we can look to develop skill and suppleness and strength and speed in a systematic, progressive fashion, so that we are building this physical preparedness and maximizing the athlete's potential at every stage of the game. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't work on strength and speed and stamina and skill and suppleness all at the same time. We do. We're working on all of the components all of the time. But of course, at different stages in that athlete's journey, what I'm saying to you is we need to focus appropriate amounts of time on each of those in a systematic fashion. And the other thing I just wanted to highlight on this graph is the fact that there are different types of bursts of power. You know, if you look at the game of tennis, just like all sports, you know, there are different movement demands and different movement skills that a tennis player can execute, some of which have more velocity-based requirements, such as, you know, just hitting the ball with the racket or the split step. But then there are also movements that you're going to have to do on the tennis court which require huge levels of strength, whether that be to overcome your own body mass as you run out to hit a wide running forehand and then having to land and decelerate 8 times your body weight, or whether that be having to accelerate from a deep position where you're not able to use the natural reactivity of the split step, but rather you have to overcome your own body mass with huge power, which is obviously based on having strength. So, you know, there's lots of different types of power that we have to prepare that athlete for. And so one of the things that I suggested is perhaps we could have some different physical tests or challenges that an athlete can take confidence from, knowing that they can achieve, which would prepare them for those different types of bursts of power. So maybe from the velocity standpoint, we could do things like figure of 8 tests, where they have to do 12 figure of 8s in 30 seconds. They only get 30 seconds rest, and then they've got to repeat that 3 times. Or maybe we could look at some of those kind of reactive plyometric jumps using a 30-second 18-inch side-to-side box jump. Or maybe we could look at more of the pure velocity component of sprinting, where they have to do some multi-directional speed running, and they have to complete each of those reps in under 16 seconds and only get 20 seconds rest. And then the other thing that I thought maybe we could do to indicate an athlete's ability to meet the demands of the game from a force standpoint would be something like this. Maybe they can jump squat with 40% of their back squat, 1 repetition maximum, for 10 reps in under 15 seconds, only get 20 seconds rest, and then do it again 5 times. But for those of you who are kind of champions of Olympic weightlifting, presupposing the tennis athlete has the technical competency, maybe then a task could be something like this, that they could do a body weight clean for 4 reps. They could then immediately follow that by 4 reps of a single arm dumbbell snatch with 1/3 of their body weight, and then they could do that in under 20 seconds. So these are just some of the tests that maybe we could use to show that an athlete has met a level of fitness that we think is going to mean that they'll be able to handle the demands of the game. Now, just keep in mind that fitness status is not a predictor of tennis success. So none of these tests are going to have the capacity to discriminate a top 10 performer like Roger Federer from a top 1,000 player. But rather what they are is benchmarks for physical preparedness for tennis that are challenging to achieve for even the highest level of player. But just at the same time, recognize these are not going to be the focus of a lot of the training that I do with some of my younger athletes particularly. So what is going to be the focus? Well, as you've said, we've got 5 S's, and I'm all about developing and maximizing their athletic potential. And for me, that means that we've got to work on skill, and we've got to work on suppleness, and we've got to work on the speed, the strength, and the stamina. So some of the things that we do at APA, which I think are quite unique, is we test skill using a coordination profile. We test suppleness using a physical competency assessment, and then we do the fitness test or the performance test, which is fairly well done in most training environments, which is mainly used to test speed. So as far as skill goes, for me, I define it as athletic skills which are built on having balance, coordination, and reaction speed. Now, these are really important areas to develop in a young athlete. Now, what you've got to get your head around is that even though skill is traditionally thought of as the domain of the sports coach, which I'm calling sports skills, there are a number of fitness components that we can target to make it easier for the athletes to acquire the skills of their sport. Now, these focus around balance, coordination, and reaction training. And what we're doing really is we're assisting the athlete to better organize their body by developing their senses, especially vision and proprioception. So this, for me, is, I think, why some strength and conditioning coaches feel that calling yourself a strength and conditioning coach is limiting, because it doesn't really speak to the total athleticism that, for me, is built on these subcomponents of skill: balance, coordination, and reaction speed. Think about a really organized athlete versus someone who appears to be clumsy and unorganized. It's skill that's going to define the difference between a good athlete and a great athlete from that standpoint. And that's why I think it's really important that S&C coaches realize that it's not just the role of the sports coach to develop sports skills. You can do some really great work in developing these subcomponents, and we can test it. And we call it a coordination profile because we thought that sounded pretty cool. And you can see here that there's about 14 different tests or challenges. And the reason I like this is because typically we use this with our mini tennis academy athletes who are kind of 10 and under. So they're definitely pre-puberty. And what we want to do is we want to give as many of those children the opportunity to excel in challenges that won't necessarily favor those children who have the most physical maturation. So yes, there are some tests here that children will do better at from a standpoint of like jumping and speed. The stronger, perhaps more physically mature children will jump higher, will jump further, will run faster. And I've spoken to my team about perhaps normalizing some of their performances relative to their stature, so we can see what percentage of their standing height, for example, they can jump vertically and horizontally. But that aside, most of the tests here are purely skill-based, which don't necessarily discriminate or reward physical maturation. So things like being able to skip, being able to do the assault course, balance the ball above the head, do the dribble challenge, the football keep-ups, the reaction speed, the balance tasks. All these kind of things are gonna reward someone who basically goes out and practices these skills and improves their ability to master themselves and the equipment that they're interacting with. And over the years, we've profiled a lot of children, and we have these 100% targets, and then we have this kind of threshold of 70%, where if I can get as many children as possible operating within these two zones, then I'm fairly confident that they have achieved a high level of skill. The other thing that we do is a physical competency assessment. And physical competency assessment, I'll tell you what it isn't. It's not a musculoskeletal screen. It's not done by a physiotherapist, and it's not a performance test either. So what is it? Well, simply, it's a video analysis of the athlete performing a number of body weight fundamental movement skills. And a lot of these movement skills are those skills that we will later utilize principally in the gym to overload the body through external resistance. So things like squat patterns, lunge patterns, press-ups, pull-ups, hops, and the single leg squat. And really what we're looking at is simply the quality of the movement. Are there any restrictions in that athlete's movement? And from my point of view, I think as a coach, it's as simple as that. We have a responsibility to ensure that our athletes are able to move as efficiently as possible, and that means that they're fully capable of moving free from dysfunction or restriction. And you can see here on the left, we have an athlete who appears to have very little in the way of restrictions. Their ankle mobility, hip mobility, and thoracic mobility are allowing that athlete to hit that high quality movement for the overhead squat. And on the other side, we've got an athlete who's perhaps restricted at the ankles and the hips and possibly the thoracic as well, and therefore is not able to perform the movement as well. And if you ask me, would I rather have the athlete on the left or the athlete on the right? From a robustness point of view and a career longevity point of view, and the ability to explore more movements, then of course every day of the week I'm going to want to work with the guy on the left. So the last thing that I wanted to share with the audience was just a very quick snapshot of the language that I use when I talk about speed. I think there's so many different terminologies that different practitioners like to use when they're talking about speed. I'm no different. I happen to like these definitions, so I wanted to share them with the coaches. So for me, I talk about multi-directional speed, I talk about straight ahead speed, I talk about first step speed, and I talk about sport-specific speed. Now, just like the 5 S's of fitness, you can't really talk about them in isolation. I already said I don't just work on one component at a time, like only skill, only suppleness. It's just about what you focus on. And it's the same for speed. You can't really truly separate any of these components out because they're all interacting with each other, particularly when you're talking about the chaotic environment of sport. But I think, like all things, at APA, I want to have a journey, and I want coaches to come on board and to understand the journey, and hopefully it makes sense so that they'll also want to coach their athletes in the same way. So generally speaking, what happens is, in order to start this journey off, I start with multi-directional speed, and I'm principally looking at this stage on the athlete's ability to stop. So I want to put the brakes in the car. You wouldn't want to drive out of the showroom with a car that had no brakes. So first things first is put the brakes on. Then once I'm happy that the child or the athlete knows how to stop safely, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start actually putting some wheels into the car. I want to make sure that they now have a little bit of horsepower. So I'm going to teach them how to produce force and actually accelerate. So I actually like to start with the traditional technical model of straight ahead speed, which other coaches might call linear speed, because I think that you can put the body in some optimal positions to develop proper triple extension by getting them to work on pushing back into the ground and just generally understanding how to run properly. And when you're doing straight ahead speed, you're not being like distracted by visual stimulus from your opponents or the ball. It's very much a head down and let's learn how to push back hard into the ground. So I like to start with that. But then what I like to do is I like to take those physical qualities that you've developed with pure track straight ahead speed, specifically spending a lot of time on acceleration, which is more relevant to tennis than top speed, and then saying, okay, well, now let's slightly modify the body position. We're going to be more upright now when we're in a tennis environment, and now we're looking at first step speed. And what really differentiates these starts over 5 meters from acceleration here is the fact that with first step speed you can be moving off of the mark in any direction, not just forward, not just linearly straight ahead, but you could be going backwards, sideways, or on the diagonals. So this is a explosive start in any direction, and critically in response to a visual stimuli of the tennis ball. So now the body mechanics are going to be more upright, and a lot of the movements are going to be initiated in reaction to or in anticipation of a visual stimulus rather than the traditional track type sprint. And then on top of that, to kind of complete the picture, I then want to apply a lot of those physical skills that we've learned in terms of how to stop and decelerate, and then how to start and be explosive. I like to put them into a tennis context where we start working much more on tennis footwork. And really what we're doing there is we're linking those elements all together, and we're just putting in the tennis shot right in the middle, so they have to explode off the mark, stop, hit their shot, decelerate, and then re-accelerate, and then repeat that cycle over and over and over again. So that might be an example of how I develop the speed qualities of an athlete. And then as far as testing, well, this is probably bread and butter for a lot of coaches who are out there. We do the same things that a lot of other coaches and training facilities will do. We create these nice little radar plots where we show with the green what the 100% target would be, and then you give a nice visual representation for the coach and for the athlete to say, hey, if my red line is outside the green, that means that I'm exceeding the target for that component of fitness. And if the red line is inside the green, that means I've got a little bit of work to do. And this particular athlete, who's one of our most outstanding athletes in across the programs that I work in, this is an 18-year-old professional tennis player who you can see in most of the qualities of fitness is exceeding the 100% target for their age group. And so overall, the percentage of physical preparedness or percentage of readiness is 98%. So I can go to a meeting with the tennis department and go, hey, this athlete, as from a physical standpoint, is way up there. So let's look at what we can do to support that athlete's tennis, because clearly they've got some physical capacities highly developed. What do we need to do to help them win more tennis matches? And then I guess the last thing that I wanted to sort of share with the audience was, well, annual planning is a big part of what I think gives an organization integrity and respect, is that coaches and athletes can see that there is a plan and that we understand how to take an athlete from a developmental stage early in their career and then build these components of fitness systematically over a period of time, and obviously then individualize them to the athlete's needs. And so the key ingredients of any training philosophy are that they respect the principles of training, which the main ones for me are specificity and overload. And we've already spoken briefly about specificity and how over the course of an athlete's career, I want to gradually increase the focus on higher level components of fitness, moving from skill to suppleness to strength to speed, and then finally to stamina, so that we can realize that athlete's athletic potential to express power endurance, which is what they need for tennis. But the thing that I also wanted to briefly talk about in this presentation was the overload component. It's important that the coaches that work for me understand how we're going to progressively overload these different components of fitness, and that we use the right amount of stimulation for the right stage of development. And so what I do at APA is I break down that journey into 6 stages, and I talk about basic 1, basic 2, and basic 3, which you can kind of see up here. And then I have advanced 1, advanced 2, and advanced 3. And these 6 stages represent the journey, and each stage builds on the previous one, so that it becomes more demanding and more stressful on the body. Now, I don't have as many progressions for some of these lower order components like skill and suppleness, because truthfully, once you have learned how to develop these basic skills, which we introduced quite early, you don't necessarily need to continue to keep developing these skills further. You just need to maintain them. And then when you get to kind of strength and speed and stamina, these are components that I feel that we can continue to challenge the athlete further and further and further throughout their athletic journey. So very briefly, just to give you a quick example of what that would look like for speed, in the mini academy we talk about basic 1. So many of the movements that we're going to develop in terms of multi-directional speed, straight ahead speed, first step speed, and sport specific speed are movements that we learn on the spot. So we're going to learn the look of a movement in pretty much a stationary position. So if we're talking about acceleration, we might be doing a wall drive. If we're talking about top speed running, we might be doing a marching on the spot. If we're talking about first step speed, we might be learning how to do the explosive hip turn on the spot, or the pivot step, whatever you want to call it. And if we're talking about footwork, sport specific speed, we might be learning how to do a proper ready position and a split step on the spot. So that's the kind of example of how we would do that. When we get to the junior academy, we develop speed in a couple of different ways. First of all, at basic 2, we want to increase the distances over which we're developing our skills. So if we would, first of all, learning how to do a skill on the spot, then now we're going to explore what that skill looks like over a greater distance. So can we keep the qualities that we've been working on in a station position and apply those qualities in more dynamic situations? And then when we get to the next level, presupposing now that we've kind of acquired the basic technical model, at basic 3, we're looking to challenge the complexity of the body by saying, hey, can you combine maybe some of those speed qualities with some different speed components? So perhaps you're going to link some plyometric jumps or some fast feet speed drills into a 5-meter sprint. And also at this point in time, we want to challenge the body from a decision-making standpoint. So can those same technical skills handle or stand up to the constant visual responses and stimulus that we're going to give that athlete? And then at the last stage, towards the end of junior academy, where perhaps for most of the children we're getting to kind of like 16 and under, we're going to start overloading those speed qualities through a force overload. So we're going to use heavy resistance, things like heavy medicine balls and weighted vests and heavy sleds, to really try and engage the athlete's ability to produce high levels of force. And then at the very end of the journey, this is our pro team athlete. We've got our junior pro, so perhaps they're 18 and under, they've left full-time education. At this point now, we're going to look at advanced 2. We're going to be looking at more of a velocity overload. So we're going to see what is the fastest possible speeds that athlete can create. And we're going to use more like light resistance. So things like parachutes and light sleds and bungees and light medicine balls, these kind of things. And then finally, at the end stage, at the kind of senior pro stage, we're going to be doing some of those speed endurance challenges consistently that we spoke about right at the beginning of the presentation. So a lot of repeated multi-directional speed sprints, and making sure that their fatigue level is not dropping too much from their best sprint to their worst sprint. So that's a little bit of an overview of the APA training system. I know we covered quite a lot of stuff, and if you want to check out the videos, you can check them out on the website, which is here, and you'll see the blog, the RacketEdge conference review. You'll be able to pick up all of the videos that I didn't show today. And if you want to discuss any of these things further, please give me an email, and I'd really appreciate it if you are interested in finding out more about us, that you give me a follow on Twitter and Instagram. And that's it, really. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.